Hi guys, welcome to today's session. This is just going to be a one-off, looking at building forms using this example of a sphere. So we'll be sort of looking at the kind of anatomy of shadows. And we're just starting with just basically a circle shape. So I've just got a very loosely sketched in circle here. It doesn't have to be kind of like a perfect freehand drawn circle, because we're kind of working with a kind of a looser approach. So we're going to be going for sort of like a bit more of a fuzzy look ultimately with the ball, not sort of crisp outlined edges. So the first thing when we're thinking about form is what's the direction of the light. So when you've got a scene in front of you, you can see the light source direction. It might be kind of coming directly at the sphere, it might be coming from below, it might be coming from above. Today we're going to go for a fairly kind of conventional direction. So we're going to look at the light coming sort of from above and to the right slightly. So this is the sort of direction of light is coming down there. Let's write that in. Excuse my very poor writing skills. So that's our direction of light, that's the light's coming down. So because of that, if you imagine sort of how the moon is, you get these sort of crescent shapes on spheres when they're lit from a certain direction. So we're going to say crescents may be coming across like this. You can sort of feel around for about the right shape. Something like that doesn't seem too bad to me. Try to get it to drop a little bit lower on that left hand side. Yeah, so something like that is our shadow on the sphere. Now this is called it's called a form shadow, and it's a shadow that occurs because the form itself, the sphere, is rolling around, light source is hitting it, and then it's going to get gradually darker, and it's going to eventually get to a point where no light is hitting it. And that's sort of like if you think of the moon. Part of the moon is visible, part of the moon is not, because the light from the sun is just bouncing onto one side of it, and depending on the angle of the sun to the moon and us, we see different crescents, different shapes of crescents, or a full moon, or a new moon. So that's what we're sort of thinking of when we're thinking of the form shadow. So form shadows occur because the form itself, the object that you're looking at, that part of the object is not facing towards the light source. So the next type of shadow, the other kind of main type of shadow, is a cast shadow, which probably makes sense to you guys already. And so that type of shadow, if we imagine we've got a little bit of a kind of background, little bench type thing that this ball is sitting on. So this little tabletop is going to have some of the light that's streaming down and hitting most of the tabletop is going to be blocked by the sphere. And that's going to make a kind of sort of stretched circle shape. I'm sure you can imagine the sort. It's a bit of an ellipse. And it's going to kind of roughly meet up to where that sphere is. And it's just going to cast down on the floor next to it. So that gives us our sort of basic shadows. So this one is, that's our form shadow. And this is our cast shadow. So what we're going to do now is just shade in the form and the cast shadow together. And you can see that doing that starts to kind of create more of the sense of the spherical nature of this ball and how it's interacting with the tabletop. Already just using those shadow shapes. So this sort of shows the importance of the shape of the shadows and how much they actually describe form. So it's not necessarily that you're rendering, sort of putting lots of gradients in. A lot of the work is actually done by the shape of the shadow. If the shape of the shadow is roughly correct, it's going to feel like a sphere, because your brain starts to fill in, oh, that's a sphere that I'm looking at. And the same thing goes for much more complex subjects. So if you're working on a portrait, if you watch any of our portrait videos, you pop the shadow in below the nose, and the nose sort of pops out because our brain wants to read the nose there. So that's our shadows loosely sketched in. So the next thing that happens inside the shadows, and most of the sort of most of the sort of interesting stuff that goes on in terms of light bouncing around occurs more in the shadows, because in the light side it's fairly obvious. It's like the light is either hitting part of the surface more or less. And we'll get into that later. But when we've got reflecting light, so that these light rays are all kind of streaming down, some of them are going to bounce off the tabletop and infill this shadow of the sphere. And depending on the angling of the sphere as it turns down, part of the shadow is going to be lighter and part of the shadow is going to be darker. Now the part of the shadow that's going to be lighter is actually going to be the part of the shadow that faces down towards the ground, which is further away from this edge of the shadow. So I'm going to call this edge has different names. I was taught it as the bedbug line, because bedbugs apparently run between the line between light and dark. It can also be called the terminator. But this line here, because it's not receiving any direct light, it's not receiving any of that direct light source, it's also receiving less reflected light, because as the sphere rolls around and it faces more towards the ground, it's going to get lighter, that shadow. So what we end up with is actually this kind of slightly counterintuitive effect where we want to get slightly lighter as we go towards the core of the shadow where that reflected light is, sort of in here, and it's going to be darker as it moves away from that. So you can sort of see that sense of reflected light emerging, and that's mainly coming from just kind of going a bit darker into this bedbug line. And darkening at the bedbug line is something that you can sort of play around a bit with. So sometimes you might not observe it happening to an enormous degree, but if you play it up, it can help a little bit. So it's always worth bearing in mind. Yeah, something like that's looking pretty good. So that's our, I'll put a little arrow there, call that the bedbug line. Again, please excuse my terrible writing. My writing always seems to get worse when I'm drawing for some reason. So that's the bedbug line. Then sort of, this is reflected light. In the shadow. So the next type of kind of important shadow is called an occlusion, and that's a place where no reflected light can bounce around within the shadow. You tend to get these at kind of like the bases of things that are maybe sitting on surfaces. So anything really sitting on a surface will have that kind of little dark edge line below it. And that's just because there's a certain point where the sphere is kind of sitting on the tabletop. And light can't bounce around anymore. So you get this kind of dark crease. In things like portraits, you get it around the nostrils. You can sort of, I'm sure you can imagine, think of people's nostrils always look kind of quite dark in their face. Corners of the eyes go pretty dark. And corners of the mouth. So with this cast shadow, as it gets closer to the sphere, it's going to get darker. But it's quite a rapid thing, the occlusion shadow, so it's not like a gradual thing. You get this quite kind of quick drop off. Just going to erase the sphere shadow back up, cast shadow a little bit. So yeah, nice and dark down in that little occlusion shadow. So pop a little note for that. That's our occlusion. So we've got our occlusion shadow. The next thing that happens, the cast shadow is fairly straightforward. You might get a little bit of a bedbug line around the cast shadow as well. The other thing that's worth kind of noting that's interesting about cast shadows is the shadow edge will tend to be a bit crisper, sharper, near where the object that's casting it is meeting the surface it's being cast on. So in this case, where the ball is meeting the tabletop, we're going to have a sharper edge. And as we move away from that, it's going to soften. You can kind of just have a look at this if you imagine, if you get your hand kind of like on a, sort of a look at my hand on this paper and I lift my hand off, you can see it gets softer. So as it's closer to where it's casting shadow, it's sharper. As it gets further away, it gets softer. This is the penumbra of the shadow, so the outer edge of the cast shadow, the penumbra. And the penumbra essentially gets softer. So we're looking for kind of variety in the penumbra. So you can see that happening there to kind of a reasonable degree. You could, if you were using tools, you can do a little bit of a smudge on stuff like that, and it's going to make it happen to a greater degree. I've kind of gone quite far with my cast shadow now, but you get the idea. So yeah, that pretty much. Oh yeah, so we'll call that. Got space for that. The penumbra. So pretty much got our shadows mapped in, which is the part of the drawing that has more, in terms of like complexity of anatomy of form, has more stuff going on. So that brings us to the lights, which are the parts of the sphere that are being directly lit. And we're going to be looking at what we call the halftones. So with the lights and the halftones, it's a bit more straightforward, as I was mentioned earlier, because we've got this direction of light means that there's going to be a point in the sphere which is just being fully illuminated. That's the part of the sphere, the surface of the sphere, that faces directly towards the light source. That's going to be lightest. Everything that slopes away from that, starts to turn away from the light source, is going to get darker. It's going to get darker in stages. Generally, you get more of a kind of fast drop-off, so like the tones get darker quite quickly right near the shadow edge, and not so much kind of like as you get closer to the light source. So that's because if you imagine, we've got like the sphere surface there, and all our light rays are kind of coming down. So that's kind of like what we're looking at. You can sort of see, if we imagine the sphere as a kind of half circle, and there's a certain point maybe sort of here where the sphere is going into shadow. You know, this slopes, this angle is very steep. But this angle, they're a lot more shallow. So that kind of like last sort of 20% or so, where the sphere is turning, suddenly gets like a big drop from what you have to get from this kind of lighter tone, which generally most of the sphere is being illuminated by a similar amount of light, to very quickly at that edge, a drop off, and that's our dark halftones. The dark halftones get pretty quickly dark. You don't want just kind of like an average sort of gradient that goes evenly up towards the light source from the shadow, because it won't feel like a sphere. That's not what's happening. As I say, this is what's happening. Most of the sphere is being illuminated directly, and the last little bit of it is not being illuminated much, and it's quickly dropping off and turning into the shadow. So you want to make sure you kind of are aware of this, because otherwise you're going to be at risk of over-modeling. And I talk a lot about over-modeling in other videos. I always try to warn you guys off it. But if you do over-model, so if you made it kind of like too even, your transition from dark to light towards this central light source, it just kind of looks heavy and dark. It doesn't feel luminous. This is how you kind of maintain luminosity, is by actually leaving a lot of it quite light. So we're going to start with our dark halftones for that reason. So I'm just going to build up in a band. That transition. And you can see already, just working on that, just down that edge, I'm not adding any tone anywhere else. Suddenly we've got a pretty good sense of that sphere turning, which is good. So we've also got a little bit of a kind of fall of light, just generally down the sphere. And these are sort of more mid halftones, and we're nearly there with all the stuff that we need to put in. Well, actually, I should probably put a little note that that's our dark halftones. So there's our dark halftones, and we've got these kind of mid halftones coming in. And the very edge of the sphere is also going to have a little bit of tone, just because this central bit is going to be our lightest part, sort of what we determined. And this is all kind of academic, obviously, because I'm just kind of making up this scenario. So yeah, that's our, so we get kind of like, here are more of our midtones. And then I'm not going to write out the highlight, just because the arrow kind of ruins the sense of the sphere. Yeah, so something like that's not too bad. Maybe just a little bit darker at the halftone edge, but I think you guys get the idea. Yeah, so that's our sort of demonstration for this week. As I say, it's a little bit of a standalone, but useful for, hopefully useful for all the other lessons that we've got up here. And it's always just good to have these principles kind of in your mind when you're drawing anything, really. Kind of like really crucial concepts, how these shadows work and how the lights work and how everything interacts. So yeah, that's it. As an exercise, you guys can kind of just do the same thing as me, so you can copy the sphere. If you need to draw the sphere out with like a compass or or some kind of thing you trace, like a mug or something, that's fine as well. And you can use pretty much any medium that you want. Pencil's obviously pretty straightforward, but anything else is fine. So yeah, that's it for today. Thanks for watching. As always, you can subscribe to the YouTube channel to keep up to date with everything that's been put up. And you can also click the link through to the website if you want to see what kind of paid qualifications we offer as well. So yeah, that's it, and I'll see you guys soon.